I'm going to try and give an overview of Mary Magdalene Studies. I've spent the last 3-4 weeks, plus 20 years studying this topic. And the idea behind the day is to bring some minds together to share collectively what we've all been researching on. And, each of us has been working on this from different angles. And I'm going to, therefore, do an overview of the scholarship that I've been looking at. And I've produced this in the form of a little bibliographical guide, which fortunately just arrived in the post. I've got 3 copies of this here. And I'm going to be running through this, using it as my kind of template. And I'll just hand this around, you can have a look at it, sort of, so you know where I'm coming from, okay? And there's a copy for you, Andy, to have a look at. The way I did this, if you look in the front of it, you'll see there's 60, well, it was originally 41, now there's 67 categories of scholarship that I reckon Mary Magdalene Studies covers. And I'm going to very quickly run through all 67 if I have time. We'll spend about a minute on each one, right? I'm going to stop halfway and we'll have a little questions and discussion of things. Each of these 67 categories is a huge subfield. If we were to, I'm amazed there isn't a Mary Magdalene Studies Association in existence yet. I've written to the Dominicans, she's the patron saint of their order, and there isn't one. There isn't even a journal of Mary Magdalene Studies. There's no recognised body doing what we're trying to do today, so this is pioneering. But given her closeness to Christ and the fact that Christianity is the biggest religion on the planet, I find this an incredible lacuna. Why is nobody studying Mary Magdalene properly? Individuals are doing things, but collectively the common mind has not yet come to bear on this, which I do find odd, whereas other saints like St. Francis have huge numbers of some Franciscan Studies associations in every country, or Dominican Studies, or whatever. So the first topic, Mary Magdalene in modern scholarship, is there have been a number of recent studies brought out because of the occurrence of new sources, Gnostic texts that have come out or been discovered at Nag Hammadi and so on. And there's been a regeneration of interest in Mary Magdalene. The old traditions, she was a repentant prostitute who made good. That was the symbolic meaning of Mary Magdalene for centuries. That's now been challenged. It looks like she was the apostle of the apostles, which is a phrase Peter Abelard used, who was the founder of modern academia at the University of Paris here in France, one of my heroes. So, and he understood her importance. So there's a number of really interesting modern scholars. The definitive study of Mary Magdalene in French was written in the 1950s by a French scholar, which is never been superseded. He looked at the history of the medieval legend right from early times onwards. He was a medievalist. A lot of medieval scholars, he was called Saxer, S-A-X-E-R, le dossier Le culte de Marie-Madeleine en Occident, des origines à la fin du Moyen-Âge. 2 volumes, 1959. So that's the kind of definitive text. Now that's never been replaced. Nobody since 59 has done such a detailed study. And one of the things that, however, individual medieval scholars have gone into it in enormous detail. One of the things they're all looking at is the different shrines associated with her. We're going to one of the most important tomorrow. There are others in the south where Sue's been. Then there are other sacred sites associated with her in other parts of Greece, in Ephesus, because the Orthodox Church have a different story about where she ended up. And then in the Holy Land itself, Bethany and Magdala. And people are working, in all these places. I bring to your attention Jane Shaberg's work, one of the most interesting modern scholars who's worked on Mary Magdalene. She's a doyen of feminist theology. This book, The Resurrection of Mary Magdalene, Legends, Apocrypha and the Christian Testament, probably one of the best and most important studies. She's looking at all the modern sources. But she wrote a book called The Illegitimacy of Jesus, and she's, as a feminist theologian, argued that Jesus was an illegitimate child, which was why he was such a marginalised person. She received huge opposition from conventional theologians for daring to say this, and so she next went on to study Mary Magdalene, another marginalised figure, right? And she points out that often people that study Mary Magdalene end up marginalised within conventional Christian academia. I wonder why. You see, it's as if the curse lives on. You know, it's weird. However, Charlesworth, who's studied, he's done this wonderful thing on the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament. He's doing a lot of work on texts that might give us an insight into the Magdalene's work. And the most recent thing that's come out is this controversial book about the Asenath and Joseph story. This is a Jewish scholar, Simcha Yakubovitsi, and reckons he's found a story of Magdalene and Jesus' marriage encoded into the story of Joseph and Asenath. So that's all very controversial and very interesting, you know. So there's lots of people working on stuff, and that first category is like a big one. The second category is more specifically about the Gnostic traditions, because obviously, as you know, the church, there were many churches. There wasn't one form of Christianity. We're used to thinking of the official form of Christianity, you know, the Orthodox Catholic or Church of England or whatever. But in the original time, they didn't even use the word Christianity. If Jesus and the disciples were meeting, they weren't Christian. You know, that concept hadn't arisen yet. You could say they were Messiah people. They believed in Christification, which was probably their word for enlightenment. You know, that was connected with perhaps an anointing ceremony of the third eye, the highest chakras, an awakening of consciousness. They were into celebrating the awakening of consciousness. They were wisdom people, enlightenment people. And Mary was part of that. She was in that innermost circle of the Enlightenment project, which I think is, from which what we know as Christianity is but a pale reflection. Okay. So it's in the scholarship that's going on about the Gnostic tradition that is very interesting, where I think we're going to penetrate to the secrets of the Magdalene tradition. Now, this might be why the Orthodox conventional church theologians don't want to touch it, because it's too deviant, or it forces them to rethink their relationship to Christianity. Well, I think that needs to be rethought. And, you know, many people turn to the East, become Buddhist, go off and find gurus in India, and, you know, since the 60s on, Western youth have been restless in search of their soul. Well, actually, it's been here all along. If we look into the Western Gnosis and esoteric traditions, our East is already here, you know. So Valentinus had some very interesting things to say about the Magdalene tradition, because he believed in the sacrament of marriage. The ritual of sacramental sexuality was part of it. Christ was always using the bride-bridegroom analogy for the mysteries, the innermost mysteries. And you know, were they teaching celibacy and a kind of disdain for the material body in that Enlightenment tradition, or were they teaching a sacramental reverence for the fact that we're souls in matter? Because the way Gnosticism is seen by conventional scholars is that it was dualistic and hated life, matter, and the point is to free the soul from the body. Whereas I think Valentinian Gnosticism and I think authentic Christian Gnosticism affirms embodiment, but wants to purify it and tame it, so that we're not driven away by wild passions and all the excesses that come from that, but we celebrate. So, for instance, in the Gnostic Mass, you know, the wine and the bread. Again, the wine symbolises the right use of ecstasy, if you want. You know, you don't need a lot to be ecstatic. Anyway, there's lots of very interesting work being done on Gnosticism, and obviously many scholars are now publishing literature to do with that. So that's very exciting, a huge field. Then we've got the question of, at the core of Gnosticism, you've got this, what I call apocalypse. And the whole question of apocalyptic studies merges over into Gnostic studies. They're different, but they're blended. Because apocalypse means literally revelation. And the literature in the apocalyptic Gospels, Mary is a revealer. In fact, she's called, in tradition, she's called an illuminator. Illuminatrix is one of the names given to her. She's a doctor of illumination. So she teaches revelation. And the Gnostic Gospels normally consist of exchanges between her and the risen Christ. I mean, how on earth was she able to see the risen Christ, you know? This is itself a revelation. Was she so finely tuned in that she could see his etheric body? Discuss. You know, Orthodox Christianity says, no, he came and, you know, walked about like the gardener. But I suspect there was something a bit more occult and magical going on. So that needs to be studied. Exactly what is apocalypse? What is revelation? That's a whole field. And what is it that's contained in the writings like the Pistis Sophia and the other Gnostic writings that she particularly seems to have specialised in? Then we got what I call neo-Gnostic groups, and indeed mystical groups, because obviously mysticism, the study of mysticism, overlaps with the study of Gnosticism. Gnosis is a form of mysticism. And in the whole history of, say, Christianity in Europe, mystical groups have often been marginalised, if not persecuted. And the first woman in France to write a mystical treatise, Margarita of Porret, was burned for saying that she could see God. She had divine revelations. And there was a trial, whole inquisitors, you know, investigated her and found her guilty. And in a sense, if you think of Jeanne d'Arc, she also was able to tune in mystically to guidance. And so Mary Magdalene was a kind of exemplar of this. And of course that's been squashed out of modern secular society. So the other reason we're no longer interested in Mary Magdalene in the modern world is because we've turned our back on mysticism in general, and let alone Gnosticism. However, there are a small number of neo-Gnostic groups, and we have a representative among us today, you know, who've kept this flame alive, and who continue to say, no, there was something at the heart of all this that is still relevant to modern times. And so the history of those groups is also part of this scholarship. And hopefully we'll learn more about that today. Even Underhill's work on mysticism, you know, pioneering stuff, still needs, there's a lot more that can be done. And the perennial philosophy of Aldous Huxley, and trying to understand this from the standpoint of transpersonal psychology, is important. Okay, then we have another exciting area, which is the area of the history of art. And she's a very much painted and much loved figure in history of Christian art. And there's a whole potential for, you know, books to be produced on this. And there's a number of people who've done doctoral theses on different aspects of her art tradition. And one thing that I was doing some research for another book I've been writing on the egg, and I discovered that in Eastern Orthodoxy she's always shown as holding a red egg, Mary Magdalene. That's her symbol in an icon tradition in the Eastern traditions. And by tradition she went to see the Emperor Tiberius to plead for the early Christians. And he said to her, you know, I don't believe what you're saying about these Christians. Christ didn't rise. It's all, you've made all this up. I don't believe that more than if you could turn this egg red. And she took the egg and it turned red. So that's why that's her symbol. Then you've got the symbol of her in the desert with the very long hair, which seems to be a mixture with Mary of Egypt, who went off and became a hermit. So there's a muddling there. But the other thing that's interesting, there's a new book come out about Leonardo da Vinci painting Mary Magdalene. They've discovered that probably he did paint her, one of his last ever paintings. Initially, nobody thought it was by him, but they've discovered this amazing painting. She's bare-breasted, wearing a red tunic, looking very fetching, looking like the Mona Lisa, but on the, you know, on the town. And But a lot of these paintings are encoded. So if you look at the history of art, they've got a lot of symbolism in them, esoteric symbolism. So there's a whole field of study there that is important. I've touched on this. How might the teachings of a Mary Magdalene friendly church, let's just do a thought experiment. Imagine Mary Magdalene had been honoured instead of Peter. Imagine the Church of Rome goes back to a lineage, starting with the first, we wouldn't call her a pope because that's far, a mater, it would be a very different looking church, wouldn't it? There'd be ordained women and men, but I think they'd be doing pretty much the same thing, serving, healing, teaching, but in a more apocalyptic and without this distancing between the clergy, God, the clergy, and the populace was the medieval image of the church. And I think a Mary Magdalene church would be very different. It would be God, with the people, as it were. Anyway, discuss. How would it be different? Okay, the sixth one is an important field, which is the relationship of Mary Magdalene to Judaism. And I've just finished a commentary on the 3 books of Enoch, which is mystical Judaism, at the time of Christ. The first 2 books are around, certainly the first one. I'm pretty sure Jesus had read it. Was Mary Magdalene literate? I think probably she was. I think Jesus certainly was. The inner circle were. They were students of sacred literature, but they had access to all kinds of esoteric stuff that's been expunged. The books of Enoch are premised on Kabbalistic understanding and wisdom, and I think this was the core of their own mystical practice. But I think it was, you see, the concept of Judaism, as opposed to, say, Christianity, hadn't really formulated, because the mystical practices of the Enochian tradition were more transcendental to that, what became a fairly parochial tribal cult associated to a particular temple. These people were skeptical of the temple tradition based in Jerusalem because it wasn't fulfilling the visionary needs and perspectives of all the people of Israel scattered throughout the whole world, let alone all the people of humanity. So you had diasporas in many cities, including Alexandria. And I think the Jesus and Mary Magdalene tradition were in touch with that wider diaspora. Also, John the Baptist was. And again, what's the relationship of Mary Magdalene to John the Baptist, to those mystical, maybe Essene-inspired Jewish groups? They were from the same tradition. I also think that Mary was in touch with the Hellenistic Judaism, because these were learned people. In Magdala, there was trade, there was toing and froing. Galilee was a sophisticated part of the Middle East, and it was at the hub of a lot of international trade routes and so on. The road going north through Capharnaum went on to ultimately to China. There were people in touch with each other much more than we realise. So ideas were travelling. So I think it was a transcendental, universal kind of Judaism they were interested in, and this is why they were somewhat sceptical of the temple cult. Okay, but discuss. The question of sexuality is crucial to our study of this. If the whole theory about which is a matter of interest, among recent scholars, about the extent of their relations. Were they married? Were Mary Magdalene and Jesus married? Were they in a sacred relationship of some kind? And then what does the church teach about this? Where is, as it were, Christian Tantra? If we're going to find it, this is where I think we're going to find it. I mean, there's a wonderful story about Shankara, the greatest Hindu sage, philosopher of the Advaita tradition, who'd reached enlightenment. He was teaching, and he was a virgin. And he said, God told him, he said, you've got to go and experience what it is to be in love. You have to have a consort. You can't be a fully human grounded avatar and carry the load of cosmic consciousness into humanity unless you've had that sexual experience. So Shankara gave up his celibacy and went and found a consort, and had tremendous learnings from that experience. That's a true story, and I think it's true with most great wisdom teachers, Buddha, whoever. The idea of absolute celibacy, I think, means that they're kind of cut off from an aspect of human experience, and so I think it's quite probable, if you read between the lines, that Jesus and Mary had this sacred relationship, and then maybe we need to learn from that and reflect on that. There are other theories that meant they couldn't be formally married. One was that Mary Magdalene had been married before and divorced. Another theory even is that Jesus had been married before as a young, they used to get married young in those days. So we can research all this, but and then others say no, the wedding at Cana was the wedding of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. These are mysteries. We don't fully know these things, but I think something was going on. What was going on is what I call a wisdom affair, I think. This is my theory, and I've written a book about this, and I think they had a mutual commitment to enlightenment, which is what the dyadic vehicle of a wisdom affair is, like Padmasambhava and Yeshe Tsogyal in Tibetan Buddhism had. Their first and primary duty was enlightenment, not just for themselves as a couple, but for the entire world. It's a Mahayana project, and sexuality as a vehicle of energizing each other's, mind-body vehicle is part of that. But then you give away the blessings, So were they consciously practicing this? It's possible. Was Jesus in touch with Buddhist or Eastern currents from India? Many people say so. That's intriguing thought. Did this really rile the authorities in Jerusalem so that they had to come and squash the movement? Yes, because it seems to me that, as Wilhelm Reich said in his book, The Murder of Christ, the Christ was so full of libido and agape and love that he was a threat to the system that is premised on Sophia-phobia and the hatred and fear of wisdom. And jealousy. If you're too blissed out, people are jealous. So you have to be as wise as a serpent, as Christ said, and as innocent as a dove. Right, so what is this wonderful text, the Pistis Sophia? This is a whole other field of study. People have been writing about the Pistis Sophia, because Mary Magdalene is the key interlocutor of Jesus in this text. She asks him all these profound questions about the heaven worlds and the different levels of existence, and where the soul goes after death, and indeed where it can travel to in consciousness, in shamanic voyaging in this life. Although it's a dialogue after he's come back from the dead, he's resurrected, and it's a very interesting text. G.R.S. Mead did a translation. I've got translations here, and I've done a reading of it. I've recorded, and I'm probably going to do a whole commentary on it, although other scholars have done it. So I tend to work on things that haven't been done, like nobody's done the 3 books of Enoch in as much depth as I've done. But I would love to do the Pistis Sophia.
Can I just ask about that? Because I think it's quite important as to how authentic that is, or whether that is, what status it has. Is it a scholarly text, or is it a channel text, or what does it look like it is to you?
That's a good question. I think it's early. It is kind of 4th century or something. I mean, it's an early text, with probably oral traditions going further back, and some of those, I think, were passed down orally in the Gnostic churches, and probably go back to source. That's my sense of the matter. Whether the events as described actually happened, that Mary Magdalene and Jesus had these discussions, I think probably not. I suspect that's an imaginative reconstruction done a couple of generations after, but possibly based on oral, maybe Mary passed on that she'd had these amazing communions with Christ. I mean, the official Gospels only have it that she saw the risen Christ and then came back and told the others. That's it. But if you read between the lines, obviously, there would have been transmissions and communications, and she would have shared all those. And in fact, in the Catholic, there's nothing I'm saying actually that is contrary to the Catholic Church's teachings, actually, because the Catholic Church has always maintained, in its true sense, that the written text is only part of the message. It's the oral teachings that Church passes down that are the rest of the teaching. And so I'm saying as a scholar we need to reawaken those oral teachings and take them seriously. And they I think do go back to source. And we can use these texts, by the close study of these texts we can reconstruct these oral teachings. The same with the Gospel of Mary Magdalene from Nag Hammadi and the other Nag Hammadi scriptures. This is one of the most exciting finds. These Gnostic Gospels hidden away in Coptic, which was ancient Egyptian in its modern form at the time, discovered by chance. Some of these scriptures ended up in Carl Jung's possession through Giles Quispel, who was one of the most exciting scholars who worked on Gnosticism. And when I went to the Vatican Library, I found out that Giles Quispel had died. I didn't even know that, because there's an encomium in his honour. He was Professor of New Testament Studies in Holland. Amazing guy, friend of the Queen of Holland, who worked away in the Coptic Library in Cairo and died of a heart attack on his way home from a day's scholarship in the library, which is a scholar's blissful way to go, And then he goes to the library in heaven. So I think Egypt is the key of a lot of this stuff. I think the fact that these things have been found in Coptic is itself interesting. Egypt was it was a very holy place, I think, to early Christians and to Gnostics. So if you haven't studied the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, do, and the other Gospels that are there, the Gospel of Thomas and so on. It tells us a lot. It's very interesting. And people are working on that. This, as I said, in the history of art, there's one particular tradition, the Penitent Mary, as she's called, which is particularly poignant. George de la Tour did those wonderful candlelit paintings of Mary, musing, and one of our friends, Danu, did a reworking of that, posing, which can go on the brochure of the Mary Magdalene Studies Association eventually. But I think that was only one aspect which was maybe overplayed in the history of art. And we need the Mary the Illuminator more. So it's a challenge to artists, paint Mary the Illuminatrix, and let's begin a new art tradition of that. I can see her with lots of fireworks going off, and things. And so, okay, the next category is question in literature and in fiction. This is a huge field in its own right. Particularly in modern fiction, there have been lots of novels attempting to reconstruct her life, and some really interesting ones. There's one that I read where she and Jesus, yes, they have a kind of, profoundly complex relationship, but Judas is also in love with her. And this is the secret backtext of why Judas betrays Jesus to the Roman authorities. It was jealousy over the woman, And this puts a whole new slant on the dynamics of the inner circle. That's a modern feminist reconstruction of what might have happened. And there's been lots of really exciting novels and fictional accounts. There's D.H. Lawrence's famous text of Mary Magdalene's role in the resurrection, which I first discovered in the bookshop on Iona in the 1990s. I was up in Scotland giving a talk, went to Iona for the first ever time. Amazing bookshop, and there was, in a locked cupboard, which I got them to open, was the original D.H. Lawrence called The Man Who Died, in which Mary Magdalene is the lover of Jesus and receives his tenderly broken, nearly dead body and revives it back to life through just love. in the way that only D.H. Lawrence can describe. You know, she goes into the depths, brings his soul back, and before you know it, you know, he's resurrected. So the image of Mary Magdalene in literature is very interesting, enormously rich. It's been a mine for you know, writers of fiction for a long time. This is one of my interesting projects that I'd like to do. I think it's long overdue that we have a new Bible, a comprehensive Bible. Here's the Jerusalem Bible, which is my favourite translation probably. Tolkien worked on it, and it's a masterpiece of literature, right? Now it's got, you know, we've got the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Apocrypha. But I think we should also have now the other Gnostic Gospels that have been discovered more recently. I think we need and I think we should have the 3 books of Enoch in. The Gnostic writings like the Pistis Sophia, and all the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. We have all these ascension texts and apocalyptic texts, which are ancient. These have every right to be in the Bible as much as, say, the Orthodox 4 Gospels, because they're older or earlier. So the Book of Jubilees, for instance. The Book of Enoch, the first Book of Enoch, is in the Ethiopian Bible, in fact. It's officially in there, in the Old Testament bit of it, because the Ethiopian church never heard it had been left out. It was St. Augustine and a committee influenced by him that left it out. But Augustine hated esoteric thought and anything that smacked of paganism because of his Manichaean roots, and he believed in the literal devil, and therefore I think this coloured his scholarship. I think, you know, that because the Book of Enoch tells the story of the fall of man and the fall of the angels, which come down to earth and corrupt mankind, and it's all a bit scary, so leave it out. We can't cope with that, was his theory. My theory is we can't afford not to have truth anymore. We need, the only weapon we humans have is truth, and the spirit of truth, which is the Christian theological understanding of the Holy Spirit. So as scholars we should be working for truth, uncompromisingly, and against any censorship of freedom of thought and academic freedom and so on. So I think we should have I don't know, the Scholar's Bible. We should republish the whole thing, and then let people decide which are genuine. Your question, you know, which is the original, which is the authentic. Let's tune in and find out. So that's one of my projects. I'm working on Oxford University printing, you know, the 40-volume complete Bible. That'd be fun. Next point is I've just been involved with this European Pagan Scholars Network, which I'm involved with, and we had an online conference. And the question of pagan studies is interesting. What do pagan scholars make of Mary Magdalene? I think they're quite interested in her, because there are signs that she was interested in pagan goddess type things. And one of the talks we're going to have later today, I hope, will touch on that. She was the inheritor, as the famous book, The Paradise Papers, points out, by Merlin Stone. The ancient, you know, the Middle East was a goddess land. The concept of the goddess was older than, or at least as old as the concept of God. And as Leonard Schlein points out in his book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess, with alphabetization, the people in the Middle East lost carnal contact with their goddess traditions, which had come through art and ceremony and music and, you know, tangible communion with each other. You know, if you think of the Minoan Creeks, these were ecstatic goddess cultures. And in Catalhoyuk and Göbekli Tepe, they think now in Turkey, is the earliest of these sacred temple sites. Now all that suddenly goes when you get the alphabet, and now it's a cerebral contact with God, a reading project. And so where does your priestess go, you know, with all that? What if you're slightly